From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral.
Good day to you all, and welcome once again to another episode of The Sculptor's Funeral. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and teacher living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself, and I really mean it this time. I have the flu. So if you notice that my voice is unusually rich and sonorous, you know why. Now, in this episode, we're going to return to Donatello one more time to examine the latter half of his life and one of his several masterpieces. We've heard in an earlier podcast about Donatello's beginnings, his early triumphs with his St. George on Orsan Michele, and his influences as well as how he influenced others. We've also previously discussed at length how Donatello is as fundamental to Renaissance sculpture for his achievements as he is difficult to appreciate in light of the Renaissance which occurred in the wake of those achievements. He was the giant upon whose shoulders the sculptors of the Renaissance stood. But rather than simply make this episode a part 2 of Donatello's biography, I want to use Donatello's story as a means of talking about a few other fundamental forces at work in the early Renaissance. The forces of power, money, politics, philosophy, and yes, even friendship. We're going to examine Donatello by learning about Donatello's closest friend in his adult life, an unlikely friendship between a curmudgeonly sculptor who thought little of money and fame, and one of the most intelligent, cultured, and powerful men in Europe, Cosmo di Giovanni de Medici. Ah, yes, the Medici. The name Medici is synonymous with Renaissance. I think most of us are at least familiar with the name Lorenzo de Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, or Il Magnifico. That astute politician, the cultured genius, the man who recognized the talents in a 15-year-old Michelangelo and raised that teenage genius at his own dinner table. Beyond Lorenzo, we might know that the Medici family produced no less than 4 popes, and intermarried with the highest nobility and royalty in Europe, and ruled as Grand Dukes of Tuscany for a century and a half. Even today, Florence's status as one of the top tourist destinations on Earth is due in large part to the Medici, whose palaces and art of unimaginable value was bequeathed to the city of Florence by the last of the Medici line. Without this singular dynasty, whose descendants never neglected to protect and nurture the city and culture which allowed them to prosper, both the Renaissance and Florence itself would be unrecognizably different. But where did the Medici come from? How did they get rich? What led them to effectively sponsor and bankroll the Renaissance? Well, that's a good little story, one which sheds a lot of light on the beginnings of the Renaissance in a way that I haven't yet covered in the podcast. The rise of the Medici family and the rise of Florentine Renaissance, they're so intertwined, they're practically the same story. So we can go back to the Middle Ages and find that at least as far back as the 13th century, the Medici family was a prosperous and respectable family in Florence. Not the oldest nor the richest family, but a family which knew how to run a successful business. The name Medici means physician, so we may assume that there was a doctor or two way back then, but the family, as far as we know, made their money in banking. After acquiring a little wealth, the family bought several properties and managed properties as well, but it was mostly through banking. The various heads of the family would have been members of the Bankers' Guild, the Arte del Cambio, and as a member of the guild, the heads of the Medici family became eligible to hold public office. Now, the Republic of Florence was basically run by its business interests. Those in too low a station of life could not join a guild and therefore could not participate in the government. But interestingly, neither could the nobility of Florence, who were known as I Grandi, or literally the big guys. So here's how the government of the Republic of Florence worked in the 14th and 15th century. Every 2 months, the names of all the eligible citizens were put into a hat, and 9 names drawn out at random. These 9 random citizens became the Priori, and together they formed a council called the Signoria. 6 members were from major guilds, 2 from minor guilds, and the 9th member became the Gonfaloniere, sort of like a mayor. Various Medici ancestors had been randomly selected for the council of the Signoria over the years, and several served as Gonfaloniere as well. This random and periodic replacement of the representative government was unique with Florence, and it gave Florence a government that truly was organized around the interests of the city, rather than like many other cities on the Italian peninsula at the time, which were ruled by monarchs or tyrants or the Holy See. The Florentines were fiercely and justly proud of their system, and it's largely responsible for the rise of Florence's prosperity in matters of trade and banking at the time. The Republic's own coin, the florin, became used all over Europe as a valued and stable currency. So, due to the random nature of the city government, it wasn't really that much of a signifier of family power to be selected to be one of the priori, or even gonfalonieri. It's what you did with that power in the brief time you had it that made the difference. And such was the case in 1378, when Salvestro de Medici was selected as gonfaloniere at a critical time in Florence, during an event known to us today as the Ciompi Revolt. The Ciompi Revolt was actually a direct consequence of the Florentine system of government. As I mentioned, only guild members were eligible for election into governmental positions, which meant the city was ruled by its business interests, again, a secret of the Florentine success. But what that also meant is that if you weren't affiliated with a guild, your interests were not represented in government. For example, someone like Donatello, he was a member of the Masons Guild, but the assistants he hired, the workers who supplied him with marble, the carters and the transporters, and such like, well, none of those guys were in the Masons Guild, or any other guild. 3/4 of the working population of Florence was not in a guild, nor could they join a guild, nor were they legally authorized to form a new guild. This lack of representation of this class of people, who are collectively called the Minuto Popolo, which literally translates into little people, this lack of representation led to abusive business practices and low wages, as it always does, and a group of workers known as the Ciompi, the thousands of low-paid workers connected with the wool trade, people like carders and weavers and other employees of the guild bosses. Well, these Ciompi had had enough. The masses seized the signoria, attacked government offices, opened the debtors' prisons, and generally caused havoc. And when things settled down, this new Ciompi-led government instituted reforms, including the formation of 3 new guilds, representing a large segment of the lower classes. They also instituted tax reform and other reforms that were actually quite modest. All the Ciompi were demanding was equal treatment within the Florentine system. They weren't calling for a revolution or overthrow of that system. But the Ciompi government didn't last too long, only about 3.5 years, as the Ciompi devolved into squabbling factions and were unable to deal with the pressures of running a government, which had to deal with exterior political and military issues at the time, all of which requiring cooperation with their antagonists, the major guilds. So most of the Ciompi reforms, including the formation of these new 3 Ciompi guilds, were repealed after the Ciompi government fell. And for centuries afterwards, the lower classes of Florence retained pent-up aggressions towards the ruling classes, and in turn, the guilds and the nobles nurtured a healthy fear of another uprising. So how does Salvestro de Medici, an otherwise unimportant middle-class banker, elected to Gonfaloniere in the summer of 1308, how does he fit into all this? Well, he was elected just before the first violence of the revolt. Now, Salvestro happened to be sympathetic to the Ciompi cause, and when he became Gonfaloniere, he instituted reforms limiting the power of the nobility and addressing some grievances of the lower classes. This met with strong resistance from the nobility, of course, and some went as far as blaming the Ciompi revolt on Salvestro's reforms. But in reality, it was just a little more fuel to an already blazing fire. At most, the reforms that Salvestro instituted were just the straw that broke the camel's back. A few months into this new Ciompi government, Salvestro de Medici was knighted, along with other citizens who were instrumental in the Ciompi revolt. But in the aftermath of the Ciompi revolt, the Medici were viewed with suspicion by the upper ruling classes. Likewise, for decades after, the Medici were popular with the lower classes, and were popularly known as a family of the people, an anti-nobility and anti-tyranny. Now, another banking member of the Medici family at the time, Salvestro's cousin, named Giovanni de Medici, well, Giovanni knew the value of a rich man having the reputation of being humble and for the people. And as his own personal wealth increased, Giovanni was very careful not to display his wealth, or the power that his wealth could wield, in a public manner. He cultivated a reputation of being kind and honest, unpretentious, and even modest. He certainly did not participate in public life as fully as someone of his stature might have, although he did his duty when called to serve on the signoria like a good citizen. In fact, this reputation doesn't really seem to have been too much of an act. Giovanni donated heavily to charity, he stayed out of politics whenever he could, and he was an honest banker with the rich and the not-so-rich equally. Now, it was right around this time that Florence, the military power of Florence, conquered Pisa, and this meant that Florence now had open access to maritime shipping via the Arno River, and the international trade of Florence boomed like never before. Giovanni de Medici was able to expand his banking well beyond Florence, to Rome, Pisa, Venice, Genoa, Naples, and even Geneva, Bruges, and London. And one of the many clients who came to Giovanni de Medici for financial advisement and loans was a man by the name of Baldassare Cosa, a Sicilian military man turned papal lawyer and advisor, who eventually became a cardinal, that elite group of church leaders from whom popes are selected. Baldassare had used a lot of backroom politicking and bribery in order to more or less buy his cardinalship, and he did so with funds eagerly provided by Giovanni de Medici. To be blunt, Baldassare Cosa was a bit of a thug, but an intelligent and enterprising one, just the kind of person on whose good side Giovanni de Medici would want to be, but also the kind of person you wouldn't want to be against in a fight. And within the Roman Church, there was indeed a fight going on. Back in 1378, a civil war of sorts erupted within the Holy See, and the outcome was that there was now not one, but two popes, each recognized by different factions within the Church, and indeed by different European powers. On one side, you had Gregory XII, recognized by Italy, Germany, and England, and on the other hand, you had Benedict VIII, recognized by France and Spain. Benedict VIII took his papal court to Avignon, France, and set up sort of a French Vatican there, and this whole mess was known as the Western Schism. This Western Schism went on for 30 years or so, but in 1408, Baldassare Cosa joined with other cardinals from both sides who had had enough, and who convened the Council of Pisa, with the goal of resolving the conflict. It was agreed by the Council of Pisa that both popes be deposed and replaced with a compromise candidate, who was elected at the Council of Pisa, named Alexander V. Problem solved, right? Well, no. The two deposed popes still had their loyal followers, and now there were 3 competing popes instead of 2. But shortly after his election, the third pope, Alexander V, he died, and elected as his successor in 1410 was none other than Baldassare Cosa, who took the name of Pope John XXIII. Now, being the banker to the Pope was a pretty big deal, even when there were 3 popes. Nowadays, the Vatican has its own bank, which doesn't change from pope to pope, but back in the 15th century, the finances of the Curia would be handled by the financial advisors and bankers of whoever was pope. And this made the Medici Bank instantly one of the most important and powerful bankers in Europe. Giovanni de Medici had nurtured his relationship with Baldassare Cosa for years, and it paid off very well. And now the Medici Bank assisted in Pope John XXIII's wars against his enemies, of which he had many, including those other 2 popes, and thus the need for huge sums to be raised on short notice, and the Medici profits from these dealings were enormous. However, this state of affairs did not last long. In 1414, the Council of Constance was convened in part in order to try and convict Pope John XXIII of various crimes, including heresy, fornication with hundreds of women, and the murder of the previous pope. Now, after a failed escape attempt, Pope John XXIII was indeed deposed, as were the other 2 popes, and finally, a final definitive new pope, Martin V, was elected in 1417, and the Western Schism came to an end. Baldassare Cosa was declared anti-pope and imprisoned in Germany. In 1418, the Medici family came to his rescue and paid an enormous ransom for his release. Baldassare Cosa then traveled to Florence, where he made submissions to the new pope, Martin V, who happened to be staying in Florence at the time, and who then amazingly appointed Baldassare Cosa to a bishop. Bishop Baldassare Cosa was to die in Florence only a few months later, in 1419. Now, with the deposition of John the 23rd, the anti-pope, the Medici lost the status of papal bankers. But when Pope Martin V's own bankers went under, the Medici Bank once again became the bank of the Pope. This effectively made them, according to historian Christopher Hibbert, not only the most successful commercial enterprise in Italy, but the most profitable family business in the whole of Europe. Ah, but wait, this is a podcast about Donatello. Even so, it's useful to know the backstory of how the Medici rose to power and wealth, even while they enjoyed the lasting reputation as a family business who looks out for the little people of Florence. But all this is merely a prelude to the magnificent and unique contributions this family made possible through their wealth and power. We'll get to that eventually, when the sculptor's funeral continues.
Hey, podcast listeners. The Sculptor's Funeral is made possible by your generous donations, as well as by our sponsor, Blick Art Supplies. That's right, friends. Blick Art Supplies, the largest and oldest provider of art supplies in the United States, shipping their quality wares around the world. Their superior customer service, extensive selection, and competitive prices make them the choice for professional and amateur artists, art educators, architects, designers, students, and hobbyists. Virtually anyone requiring quality art materials for work or for pleasure. And seriously, there isn't another art supplier on the web with as many supplies and materials specifically for sculptors than Blick. It's really huge. They have over 70,000 products for artists of all types. You can get everything you need, from dozens of different clays and plasters to fine Italian marble carving tools, clay modeling tools, specialty casting mediums, body casting supplies, turntables, armatures, books on sculpture, you name it. If you need it for sculpture, they got it. And shipping is free in the U.S. for most items if your order is over $100. But Blick is not merely a place to buy stuff. Their sales staff and product information specialists are trained to hunt down answers to your tough questions regarding materials, techniques, and safety. Hundreds of Blick videos are also available at dickblick.com and on YouTube, including video lesson plans for teachers and product demonstrations for artists. And best of all, by buying your art supplies from Blick, you contribute directly to the support of the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. All you need to do is this. Go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and click on any of the banner links that you see there. And that will take you right to the Blick website where you can buy whatever you need. It's that simple. Just remember that you need to click through a link on thesculptorsfuneral.com first so that Blick knows I sent you. So the next time you stock up on armature wire, mold rubber, modeling tools, and plastilina, do it in a way that supports the only podcast out there devoted to the global community of figurative sculpture. Go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on Blick and support the show. Thanks.
So where does our young friend Donatello fit in this story? Well, with the anti-pope, John the 23rd, dead in Florence, the Medici family thought it fit to give him a funerary monument in Florence, fit for a pope, as both the Medici and Florence in general still thought of John the 23rd as a legitimate pope. It was even decided to place the tomb in the Florence baptistry itself, the most sacred site in Florence. But for a monument, of course, you need a sculptor and an architect. And it was Donatello, in partnership with the young architect Michelozzo Michelozzi, who created the tomb. The surviving records are scant for this project, and it's a matter of debate as to how much or which parts either Donatello or Michelozzo did, or even when it was begun or finished. We can say for sure that the tomb was started and likely finished within the 1420s. Now, to put that date into the context of Donatello's life, Donatello had finished the St. George in 1417, and for the next 10 years he was busy populating the niches of the Duomo's bell tower, called the Campanile, with statues of prophets and saints. He was also creating some beautiful relief work for the Cathedral of Siena, among many other works. Now, it seems likely that the monument to the anti-pope became a collaboration due to Donatello's inexperience with architectural work.
It was the first time Donatello and Michelozzo the architect collaborated, and they collaborated several more times in their lives, but they certainly knew each other before the collaboration on the antipope tomb. Each of them had worked at one time or another for Lorenzo Ghiberti in his workshop, which was in the process of completing Ghiberti's first set of doors for the baptistry. It is even sometimes said that Michelozzo is a former pupil of Donatello. In the baptistry, the antipope tomb of John the 23rd is located set between two large pillars, and is composed of lots of different elements. You've got an effigy figure in bronze lying on top of a sarcophagus. You've got a decorated base plinth, a type of entablature with niche figures representing the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity, and a carved drapery known as a pall acting as a canopy over the entire work. And when it was finished, it was the tallest and largest sculpture in Florence, and notable for its conscious classicism in the rendering of both the design and in the allegorical figures. It's one of the few works by Donatello which exhibits such classical influence so strongly. But beyond the fact of the commission itself, the tomb was a departure in a new direction for Donatello. In Michelozzo, he found an excellently well-suited partner for the architectural elements of future works, but the commission also most likely brought him into first contact with a man who would become his closest and oldest friend, Cosmo de Medici, the son of Giovanni de Medici. Now, Cosmo de Medici and Donatello were only 3 years apart in age, and so when they presumably got to know each other in the 1420s, they would have been in their early 30s. But of course, both men would have known all about each other before they met, as they were both famous Florentines by then. Donatello for his outstanding sculpture, and regarded already by many as the most talented artist of the day, and Cosmo de Medici would be known, of course, as the talented and intelligent scion of the Medici family, whose potential, given his advantages, was without limits. As with other sons of wealthy Florentines, Cosmo de Medici received the best education possible at the time, learning several languages, including Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, as well as your usual French and German. His private tutors were some of the keenest intellects to be found, schooling Cosimo in the classic literature that was available. And he wasn't merely a good student, and he didn't merely absorb the lessons he was taught. No, Cosmo de Medici developed a deep and abiding attachment to the classical ideas and ideals behind his studies. He was bitten by the humanism bug. The classical ideal became closely allied with his own ideals, and the study and contemplation of the nature of humanity, its purpose and destiny, and the pursuit of the best way to live a worthy life became central to who Cosimo was as a person. Now, at the same time, Cosimo de Medici was his father's son, a prudent and at the same time ambitious banker, whose success gave him influence, money, and power to do as he would. Taking his father's lead publicly, Cosimo was a humble man, and he cultured the reputation of the Medici, being a family who looked out for the little people, the minuto popolo, while at the same time acted as advisor and loan shark to the nobility and clergy of Europe. As learned and as intelligent as Cosimo was, he wasn't the first humanist in Florence, nor even close to the most learned. That title probably goes to Niccolò Niccoli, 25 years older than Cosimo, one of Cosimo's tutors, and who inspired Cosimo in many ways. But what Cosimo was, though, was the richest humanist. And he allowed the Florentine humanist circle to prosper, and he funded research, translations, and scholarly expeditions. He developed a collection of antiquities and manuscripts from which others might study, in emulation of Niccolò Niccoli's library. He funded the expeditions of Poggio Bracciolini, who was a manuscript hunter who scoured the monasteries of Germany and Switzerland in search of lost and forgotten antique literature, and who rediscovered a sizable portion of the classical canon. And Cosimo commissioned Poggio Bracciolini to produce copies of these manuscripts in Poggio's own fastidious and clear handwriting. And Poggio Bracciolini's handwriting style later would be used by bookmakers, and today we know Bracciolini's handwriting as Roman type. Another Florentine humanist's handwriting, that of Niccolò Niccoli, would become the basis for italic type. Now, personally, what strikes me when I read about Cosmo de Medici is that he appears, like his father, to be a truly humble man, as rich and powerful as he was. He showed a tremendous interest and respect to anyone who was a master of what they did, whether that's the study of ancient literature or the practice of new and progressive arts, such as the progressive architecture of Filippo Brunelleschi or Michelozzo, or the sculpture of new and worthy artists such as Donatello. And with Donatello, this respect became the basis of a great friendship between the two. At the same time, Donatello and Cosimo were a bit of an odd couple. Vasari records several instances which illustrate what a cantankerous stick-in-the-mud Donatello could be, and how Cosimo not only tolerated this, but kind of loved Donatello for it. Again, it's from Giorgio Vasari, so these stories are probably not the gospel truth, but they probably have some truth at their core as to the nature of their friendship. At least one of these stories, though, can be corroborated by other sources. One story is that Donatello suffered a little bit in old age, not only in health, but in finances, and his friend Cosmo De Medici gifted Donatello a small tenant farm outside of the city. Donatello then became the beneficiary of all the profits of that farm, which was worked by a tenant farmer. However, after about a year, Donatello demanded that Cosimo take the farm back, because he was sick of hearing the tenant farmer complain about things going wrong on the farm, and Donatello was always having to look to the farm's upkeep. According to Vasari, Donatello was so weary and disgusted with all this that he would rather die of hunger than have to think of so many things. With good humor, Cosimo took the farm back into his possession, but still let Donatello have the profits from the farm. The real testament to the friendship between these two men comes not in the form of a story from Vasari, but from Donatello's tomb itself, which silently speaks volumes. He died in 1466, 2 years after his friend Cosimo died, but before he died, Cosimo had arranged to grant Donatello an extraordinary honor. Donatello's remains are entombed in the crypt of the Church of San Lorenzo, the family church of the Medici, lying very close to the tomb of Cosimo himself. Within the Church of San Lorenzo, you'll find over a dozen of the Medici family buried, but very few others outside the family were so honored. Cosmo de Medici's study of antiquity was done as part of an attempt to reclaim classical culture and foster its ideals in the present culture. And naturally, achieving this goal would include commissioning architecture, painting, and sculpture based on the models and ideals of the past. And sometime in the 1430s, this patronage of the arts included the commissioning of a statue from Donatello by Cosimo that was, at the same time, a revival of the past, but also something entirely new. This statue is known as Donatello's Bronze David. We call it the Bronze David because there's a much earlier David that Donatello did in marble for the Duomo. Now, sadly, the creation of the Bronze David is almost completely undocumented. We can't say when it was made, or even why, or where it was originally intended to go, or even exactly who commissioned it. Cosmo de Medici is probably the most likely, but perhaps it was commissioned by his father, or maybe even perhaps the Signoria. But general consensus says that the David was commissioned by Cosimo, made for either the old family palazzo, or the new one being built in Florence around the time, and that time being somewhere in the 1430s or the 1440s. And what we know for sure is that the David was the first large-scale, freestanding bronze statue of the Renaissance, the first since antiquity. The Bronze David is probably the most groundbreaking sculpture of the Renaissance, as it is a revival of the achievements of antiquity on several levels heretofore unattained. But before we get into all this, let's just take a good look at this Bronze David. And what do we see? Well, the Bronze David is a bronze statue of a youth, maybe about 14 years of age, small and slender. Its life size or thereabouts, about 158 centimeters or about 5 feet tall, which isn't too small for a 14-year-old. Now he's standing there in a sort of a strong contrapposto with his hip kicked out, one hand on his hip, and in the other hand he's holding the hilt of a large sword with its point touching the ground. His left foot rests on the severed head of the giant Goliath, which still wears a decorated helmet. As for David himself, he is almost nude, except for a hat decorated with flowers and a type of armor for his lower legs
which are called greaves, and they're basically shin guards. So, at its face, to our modern eyes, it's not anything we might automatically assume is groundbreaking. If anything, it's kind of a weird little statue. The David, a character in art we're all so familiar with thanks to Michelangelo's heroic, perfectly muscled statue, seems a little weak in comparison with other Davids. Some people think he's a little too effeminate to go with our conception or stereotype of what a hero or military victor might look like. Also, why is he naked except for a hat and shin guards? Okay, so whatever, it's a little out of the ordinary, but what's the big deal about this statue? Well, this statue is a big deal in a lot of ways. We can start with the fact of the parameters of the commission itself. Cosimo charged Donatello to produce a statue which would go into the center of a courtyard of a palazzo. Now, the last person to do something similar, that is, commission a large figurative work as a freestanding work unto itself, not connected to a church or a funerary monument, but just made for personal enjoyment and contemplation, well, that art patron probably died with the ancient Roman Empire. A large-scale figure, in bronze no less, done merely for art's sake. This is entirely new, and it takes a leap of the imagination on Cosimo's part merely to think of commissioning it. Remember that up until this point, sculptors basically had one patron, the church, and large and expensive sculpture was exclusively the servant to architecture, whether as a bronze door or a statue in a niche or a relief on a wall. And that, of course, brings us to our next point. It's a freestanding statue, which means it's not in a niche. It will be seen from all angles. And this adds a dimension, literally, to the composition of statuary that had not been an issue prior to this point. Niche statuary was finished only up to the extreme edge of the viewing angles, and the backs of sculptures that go into niches generally were left uncarved, or in the cases of bronze were just sort of open in the back. A freestanding statue presents not only new compositional challenges, but technical ones as well, which we'll get into in a minute. But then we come to the nudity of the work. Now, we've seen nudes in early Renaissance sculpture before, all the way back to the Daniel on Nicola Pisano's pulpit, as well as Ghiberti's Isaac for his competition panel for the baptistry doors. But these nudes, as well as other examples, are a bit different than the nudity of the David. Nicola Pisano and Lorenzo Ghiberti and others used ideal nude forms to directly reference the antique. They're copying the ideal physiques of Greek and Roman work in order to allude to the Platonic notion that an ideal physical form is symbolic of perfection of the soul. But Donatello's David cannot be placed into the canon of the ideal nude. It is not ideal musculature at all, but rather realistic, or, to put it better, naturalistic. This is the real body of a real person, not a physical manifestation of the ideal. And yet, he's nude. Now, the more obvious reason for his nudity is basically this sculpture was a showcase for Donatello's skill in visual reckoning and manual rendering. With this nude, he's attempting something no other Florentine artist had yet done. If nothing else, it's a tour de force exhibition of how far Florentine sculptors had come in the previous decades. Further, the David is nude not to illustrate the perfection of the soul, but mostly for the appreciation of the human form as it exists. David's nudity does not allude to the spiritual realm, but to the reality of an adolescent in repose after his adventures. So although the subject of the statue itself is biblical, its conception, from start to finish, is humanist. Theology gives way to sensuality. Spiritual aspiration makes room for physical beauty. The essentially humanist aspect of the Bronze David is one that is often overlooked these days, strangely, and this has led some art historians as well as art lovers to make some incorrect assumptions about this statue. But make no mistake, this work is, at its core, an expression of humanist thinking, showing the biblical story of David through a humanist lens, which places the reality of human experience as perceived through our senses at the fore. As much as the David was a philosophical statement on the part of the man who commissioned it, it was also the culmination of a line of inquiry Donatello had been making with his sculpture in the previous decade. In Donatello's work at the time, we see a gradual emergence of the human figure out from underneath the subject's clothing. The figures that Donatello made for the Campanile of the Florence Duomo effectively chart the course of Donatello's exploration of the nude and how to render it. It's apparent that Donatello had come up with a method of working directly from observation of the nude, i.e., from live models. It should be remembered that the systematic study of anatomy didn't exist at the time. Not until Leonardo da Vinci comes along, a few decades down the road, do we get the scientific and objective study of the human body's mechanics that so characterizes the High Renaissance. So, barring classicism and barring anatomical knowledge, Donatello's approach to the figure in this work must have been largely informed by some system of visual observation. And this approach fits in perfectly with what other Florentine artists were thinking about at the time. The intense study of optical and visual perception was all the rage, from Brunelleschi's experiments with painting using one-point perspective, as well as perspective in relief as seen in the second set of Ghiberti's doors, and, of course, the codification and dissemination of the science of perspective by the publication of Leon Battista Alberti's book De Pittura. There simply is no reason to believe that Donatello wasn't pursuing the science of optics and visual method as it relates to sculpture in the round, similar to his line of inquiry that led him to staccato relief sculpture. And as we see in his Campanile statues, his ability to render naturalistic human form steadily increases. Faces become portraits. Bodies move from generic forms to very, very specific body types of definite character. Arms are left bare all the way up to the shoulder. Drapery falls from the torso in order to partially reveal the torso. All this belies close, systematic study of the living nude, a working method of modeling from life. And this direction of exploration reached its zenith with Donatello's statue of David, which has no precedent in the antique nor in his contemporaries' work. Instead, Donatello seems to have relied greatly on a single living model, largely eschewing antique precedent, although he does choose to classicize the portrait somewhat. Now, systematic use of a single live model for a sculpture probably originated right here with the David, with the first nude. See, with draped figures, statues could be cobbled together from different people or different poses, and the joints of one part to another could be masked by drapery. But here, for the first time, with the entire figure laid bare, the figure had to be considered as a whole. There is another aspect of the David which has kept this work talked about and popular right into our own day. What do today's sculptors and historians focus on when speaking of the David? Well, it's not the David's humanist qualities, nor is it the striking naturalism of the work that keep historians and art schools discussing the David. No, it's the so-called homoeroticism of the work that some people seem to be fascinated with. You really can't find a description of Donatello's David anywhere that doesn't mention the sensual qualities of the work at least, and often you will find statements to the effect that the David was Donatello's expression of his own homosexuality, or perhaps a statement on the sexual and cultural norms and taboos of his time and place. And it's weird. It's an idea that people fix upon this statue that is very, very persistent. I mean, if a first-year art history student or a first-year sculpture student knows anything about the David, it's usually something they heard related to its homosexual overtones. The writer Mary McCarthy, in her ever-popular book The Stones of Florence, wrote that Donatello's David, in boots and a bonnet, is a transvestite fetishist's dream of alluring ambiguity. More respected and respectful writers, including art historian H.W. Jansen, have also felt compelled to speculate along these lines that this has something to do with Donatello's sexual identity. So what is it about the David that makes people think this? Well, it seems to be a combination of things. The realistic nudity of an adolescent boy, combined with what some call an effeminate stance, combined with a soft hat decorated with flowers, combined with David's shoulder-length hair, combined with the unexplained placement of a feather which trails up the inside of David's thigh almost to his crotch. All these subtle clues, when taken together, say the experts, create a picture of an artist expressing his sexuality the only way he could,
through his art. Well, folks, I am here to tell you today that this theory is complete rubbish. It's a theory that became popular decades ago, in the middle of the 20th century, when the general bigotry against homosexuality allowed for this type of thinking to be part of art historical discourse. So many factors point to this being a junk theory. First and foremost, the idea that an early Renaissance artist had much of a notion of or impulse towards self-expression of his personal identity in any sort of way is historical revisionism. See, unlike the artists of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, conscious self-expression was simply not an aspect of art making in the Renaissance. The notion of art as a vehicle for self-expression pretty much originated with the Romantic period in art. And up to that point, art told stories deemed worth telling, either from history or religion or myth. Now, these stories instruct the viewer in some way, or edify, or exhibit a theology, or an ideal, or a concept of some sort. Now, the very idea that Donatello would imbue a commissioned work with an explicit expression of his sexual identity, it's ludicrous. Isn't it strange that, as obvious as the sexual overtones appear to some today, no one in Donatello's time seems to have noticed enough to comment on it? Cosmo de Medici, who paid for the statue, and who was a married man with several mistresses to boot, he certainly didn't seem to mind, if the notion ever occurred to him. There is no doubt that Cosimo would have seen the clay or wax model before it was cast, and given his explicit approval to have the expensive and laborious process of casting a large bronze work carried further. It is, of course, possible that Cosimo did indeed share the same point of view about the work that Mary McCarthy did, and he just didn't mind about the sexual overtones, but all this is just speculation. This self-expression theory says much more about the sexual mores and issues of the 20th century than it does of Donatello's time. Adherence to this theory implies the old stereotype of homosexuality as pathology, the trope of the homosexual ruled by his ungovernable appetite to the point where it permeates and taints everything he touches. It's mid-century bigotry masked as Freudian psychoanalysis. What this theory really tells us is that many people are uncomfortable with the nude figure when it doesn't meet our physical expectations. So we seek to explain variation with a presumed pathology. Donatello makes a nude boy more effeminate than the norm? Well, he must be gay. There's a similar theory about Michelangelo, too. Michelangelo once made a female figure look more masculine than the norm, and the theory for this is that Michelangelo was gay, and expressing that gayness through this figure. By the way, it needs to be pointed out that both Michelangelo and Donatello were likely gay or bisexual. There's documentary evidence and contemporary accounts for both men that allude to that, and although it's ultimately unprovable, it's been a foregone conclusion for centuries. And that's one more reason that this junk theory persists, is that it's seen as corroborating evidence to this conclusion. But that's the laziest sort of scholarship, to look for evidence to support a foregone conclusion, which is how this theory arose. But one final reason I think this theory gets repeated in the art schools and ateliers is the lack of a better theory to explain some of the strange passages in the Bronze David. Why the flowery hat? Why the shin guards? And what's with the feather running up the inside of David's thigh? What purpose could that possibly serve? I mean, that feather is very much there, right? And it could have more easily been left out. So it must be there for a reason. It must have a reason for being. Okay, well, let's address these one by one. First off, the hat. The hat donates the character of David as a shepherd. And for centuries, this has been recognized. We find other shepherd characters, notably from Greek and Roman myth, who wear similar hats, such as the shepherd god Aristeus. So the hat alludes directly to the character of David, the boy shepherd, and it does so in a classical motif. So there you go. That's why he's got a hat. But let's take a closer look at this strange feather. Why is it there? Well, the decapitated head of Goliath under David's foot is wearing a helmet, and this helmet is adorned with birds' wings sprouting from either side of the helmet. Now, one wing is fairly short, while the other is at least twice as long, and rather purposefully runs up almost the entire length of David's inner thigh. It isn't much of a stretch to see this as sexually suggestive if you wanted to find something suggestive in the David. However, There are at least two much more reasonable, much more simple, and practical explanations for this oddly placed wing than as an expression of sexuality. Two very practical reasons which occurred to me years ago, though I have never heard an art historian put either of these explanations forth. And maybe it's because these justifications for that feather might only occur to a practicing sculptor rather than an art historian sitting at his or her desk. So here's what I think. Now, as mentioned, Donatello's David was the first freestanding nude sculpture made in bronze for centuries. There was just no precedent for Donatello to rely on in the creation of a freestanding figure in clay or wax. So many technical issues involved with the creation of a life-size, freestanding clay model would have been left up to his best guesses. For instance, would a life-size bronze statue need a third leg to support the weight of the figure like a marble sculpture does? You know, like how Michelangelo's David, which is in marble, has a tree trunk connected to one of David's calves, and it acts as a stabilizer. In fact, all marble nude statues need some sort of third leg, or else they crack right above the ankles, the thinnest part of the statue. Bronze is strong, but it can also deform easily under pressure. It actually has a denser mass than marble, so it's actually heavier by volume. And bronze casting at the time was done quite thick, meaning a bronze figure might weigh almost as much as the same figure done in marble. So without having a precedent of a life-size nude bronze to use as a guide, it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that Donatello added the wing to thicken and strengthen the weight-bearing leg of the figure. The wing, in effect, creates that third leg. Another possibility about this wing concerns the unprecedented technical operation of designing a life-size armature to support the modeling of a nude figure in clay or wax. Even today, this is a tricky process, building up a life-size figure in clay. Now, usually we have exterior side arms that we run into the figure that carry the weight of the figure, and these exterior supports allow for the repositioning of the armature, so you can move the limbs around, even the weight-bearing leg of the pose. Right? But there's no evidence that Donatello used any sort of exterior support or sidearm. So the armature has to be strong enough and stable enough to support the weight of the clay figure. So if you're not using an exterior support, what do? So probably the first thing I would do would be to run an upright post, right? A fixed upright, right through the weight-bearing leg of the pose. And from this fixed and immobile support, I would then construct the rest of the armature. So the stronger an armature needs to be, the more difficult it can be to alter the position of the armature, to change the pose, once you start working. And this would go double for the position of the weight-bearing leg, which naturally would be the one part of the armature made completely stable and immobile. Now, in our own sculpture studios, when we work on figures in clay, we've all seen bits of armature breaking through the surface of our figures as we work on our clay models. And when that happens, we can do several things, right? Our choices are, at that point, to move the armature to accommodate the position of the figure we would like, or we just sculpt around the protruding bit of the armature, as we can remove evidence of the armature at a later stage of the casting, like at the wax stage. But another solution would be to sculpt the leg as you would like, and then cover up the protruding armature by adding another element of design into the sculpture. To me, Donatello's wing, resting on the inside of the weight-bearing leg, is in exactly the position I would most likely expect a fixed immobile armature to protrude. It's actually happened to me in exactly this way, more than once, and I regularly see instances of this in my figure classes that I teach. Now perhaps this happened to Donatello, and he decided to kill two birds with one stone by adding the feather. The feather hides the armature and adds a third leg of support. And maybe he felt that even this wasn't enough support for the bronze figure, and so he adds the greaves, the shin guard armor, which thickens the lower leg just above the ankles, precisely at the thinnest and structurally the weakest portion of the figure. I suppose we'll never know the answer to the question of the wing, but out of the various theories I've considered, self-expression of sexual identity, to me, seems the least likely. In any event, whatever we think of Donatello's motives is much less important than the paradigm-shifting course charted by Donatello with this single sculpture. The David puts forth the notion that art can be something other than a theological tool or an icon of a patron saint and protector from the spirit world. That art can have a life beyond the walls of a church, physically and metaphysically. The David was commissioned to serve as a symbol of power and strength arising from a source where it might least be expected, to serve as a focus of contemplation and a daily reminder of what Cosmo de Medici and indeed the Republic of Florence held dear. It is a symbol of Florentine ideals, just as antique art served as symbols of classical ideals. The difference between the David and all classicizing Florentine sculpture before it is a question of cause and effect. Before the David, sculptors emulated the ancients by copying togas, portraits, and contrapposto pose, all the effects and affectations of classical antiquity. But it is with Donatello's David we see a sculpture reflecting the cause of antique sculpture, the urge to glorify an ideal and proclaim it publicly. Stretching the metaphor of the term Renaissance, we might say that up to this point, Renaissance sculpture was gestating, and with the David, the full scope of what sculpture had been in the past was at last reborn. Well, thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget you can join in the conversation at our Facebook group page for the Sculptor's Funeral. It's been really growing, actually, over the last month or two. We have a couple hundred people on the Facebook group page now, so it's a good place to go and meet like minds. You can submit a post there, you can ask a question there, you can leave a comment, or you can just say hello. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or on iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts, and receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device every week. And if you do go to iTunes to subscribe to the show or just to listen to it, go ahead and give the podcast a rating. Right? Leave a line or two commenting on the podcast if you like it. Check out the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, where you can stream the complete archives of the show without having to subscribe to anything. You can check out the image galleries for this and for each episode there, and all for free. And if you are in the market for some art supplies, you can always click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies. Doing so supports the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.